When I think back on all the fears when I was pregnant, all of them dismissed except for one. The only test the state mandated was genetic. Looking for that extra chromosome.
Hello, and welcome to the If We Knew Then podcast. I'm Stephen Sachs,
And I'm Lori Sachs.
and today we're joined by Dr. Tom Mahan. Tom specializes in Alzheimer's research with a focus on individuals with Down syndrome. Tom is a father of 3 boys, and his oldest son, Teddy, has Down syndrome, and Teddy really sparked Tom to take his already existing research of Alzheimer's and guide it and focus it on individuals with Down syndrome. Alzheimer's is one of those things on that list that we're given when our children are born. It's something that many of us parents think about. Well, we know knowledge is power, and with this research and knowledge, we have the ability to grow and evolve and work towards finding a cure for all individuals with Alzheimer's. This is an eye-opening conversation, but it's a conversation for us that brings a lot of peace of mind and ease. Because just the fact that our community is now a part of that conversation is proof that the evolution of humanity is alive and well to changing the narrative of Down syndrome. So please welcome Dr. Tom Mahan. Hello, Tom.
Hey, how are you?
Good to see you.
Yeah, nice to meet you guys. Thank you so much for having me today.
Oh, no, we were really excited when we heard about you and then read about you and then really wanted to have you on.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it.
We heard about you through Ben Hughes because you are going to be presenting at one of the DSDN retreats. Well, I should probably let you talk more about yourself.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so the DSDN retreat is coming up here in a few weeks, here in St. Louis, Missouri, which is where I'm currently located. And so it's going to be bringing dads from all around the country here to St. Louis. And so I'm going to be talking about a little bit of my research, which focuses on how Alzheimer's disease develops in Down syndrome, but also talking a little bit more broadly about some of the different scientific research that's being done to better understand Down syndrome, and also talk a little bit about some of my own personal experience with my son, who has Down syndrome, and one of the actual research opportunities that he had, where he actually was part of a study looking at neuroimaging, and he was actually involved in that as an infant. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those different research opportunities and some of the personal experience of having gone through that as well.
Now, you started researching Alzheimer's before your son was born, correct?
Yeah, correct. Yeah. For about 5 years before my son was born, I had been researching Alzheimer's disease. And so when he was born, it was kind of one of those things for me that, there was, the process of, not only adjusting to being a new parent, but also being a new parent to a child with Down syndrome. But then also for me in my research, and having been involved with Alzheimer's research for about 5 years, it kind of made me start to think about where I was going in my career and what I wanted to really focus in on for my research. And with that, I kind of realized that, the universe was kind of giving me a big sign with the birth of my son that, for me and my purpose, it was really kind of a realization that, for me, I really wanted to then focus in particular on how Alzheimer's disease develops in those with Down syndrome.
What did you know about Down syndrome before your son was born?
So I knew a little bit about Down syndrome, in college and even afterwards. I'd done volunteer work with the Special Olympics. It's why I worked as a buddy at the Special Olympics and worked with some kids who have Down syndrome. And my wife is actually a special education resource teacher. And so she had, worked with kids in the school setting who have Down syndrome and other different types of, intellectual disabilities and things like that. And so I had been aware of it, and kind of had just a little kind of basic knowledge of Down syndrome. But when we got the diagnosis, we found out prenatally at about 20 weeks with our 20-week ultrasound. When we got that diagnosis, it definitely was, a whole new world after that in terms of understanding Down syndrome. And and having been an Alzheimer's researcher at that point, I was aware about the connection between Alzheimer's and Down syndrome, but just at kind of a more basic level, but really, didn't have a full depth and appreciation for how those with Down syndrome are impacted by the disease.
How would you say your experience with researching Alzheimer's and then your wife's experience with individuals with Down syndrome, how would you say that impacted the way you received or felt about the diagnosis?
Um, I would say that, it was still very surprising. We we really had no family history of having anybody, in our family that had a child with Down syndrome. And while we had a bit of an understanding of Down syndrome, it still was quite a shock. We still, kind of went through that period of just trying to make sense of and understand what it was that we would be going through and facing with a child with Down syndrome. And so I think that we were fortunate in that we at least had enough of an understanding and an experience, knowing those with Down syndrome to know that, there is such a wonderful life that they can live, and that there's so many wonderful opportunities for them in today's society to be included in school and, different activities that, we knew that there would be lots of challenges, but that there would also be, wonderful opportunities, for our son to live a wonderful, fulfilling life. But it was tough. And I think we did go through a bit of a grieving period at first of just trying to understand that, as first-time parents, that our journey would be different. That the things that we had kind of been, thinking about and anticipating of what it would be like to become parents, that things were going to be a little bit different. And so we kind of, I say we did a little bit of grieving because it was kind of grieving what we had expected. But then to go through that process of then realizing, the different journey that we would be on, a little bit different, a little more unique than what other parents go through.
Because you have 3 kids,
Yeah.
correct? And I'm curious, like, how do you feel like I know at the beginning of the journey, you felt like you had to grieve what you thought your child was going to be. How do you feel about that now, 7 years into it? How do you feel about the thought that there was something that you had to grieve?
Yeah. So, I mean, looking back in retrospect, I wish I would have had a little bit more of a better understanding now, like I do, of just how wonderful our son would be, and how much love he would give to us, and all the joy that he gives us. Um, and I don't want to, like, beat myself too much for, for back then, for, kind of being sad and disheartened about having the initial diagnosis. But also think that part of that comes from, at the time, just some of the different societal views and what's out there about Down syndrome. And I still think there's catching up to do within our society to just get a better understanding of what it's really like to have Down syndrome and what it's like to have a loved one with Down syndrome. And I think that for me, I kind of in my head went through this process of, I'd been thinking about, all right, am I gonna be able to coach my son in baseball? And he, is he gonna play all these sports? And am I gonna be able to be his coach and do all this? And I started to question that and doubt that. And in retrospect, I wish I hadn't done that as much, because, my son, he's playing soccer. He just finished doing a special baseball league with T-ball league, and I've been helping, coach, do some assistant coaching for, the soccer team that he's participating in. And so there's still all these wonderful experiences and opportunities there for him. And so, I think that part of one of the things that I'm, continuing to try to do, both with, advocating for for Alzheimer's research and things like that, and a better understanding of that, but also just more broadly for Down syndrome, is just trying to continue to raise awareness with people that I meet, about how just how wonderful he is and how wonderful life is for him. So
I don't want any parent to beat themselves up. I feel like that's one thing that I want to change for parents when they get a diagnosis is those feelings, because we had those feelings. Stephen just had a conversation, a few days ago, and it's, I think when it comes to dads, it's the first thing that you think of is,
throw the ball.
Will I be able to throw the ball?
Right.
And that's something that I do believe is societal, that gets put upon us because of the narrative that's told about Down syndrome. And I do believe it's changing for people who are coming behind us. I wanted to talk to you about it because you even had information. Like your wife taught children with Down syndrome. And
there's no way you could go through doing Alzheimer's research without some kind of knowledge about Down syndrome. I think that's would be at least, you take some part of a class or something where you would talk about that part,
Yeah, and even like you have 2 other children, but when I'm willing to bet that when those children were born, nobody told you to grieve what they wouldn't be, because you didn't know what they were going to be.
Know. Mm-hmm.
And you're given, but you don't know what are your children's name? We don't even know what your kids' names are.
So my oldest son, Teddy, he's 7. He actually just turned 7 yesterday.
Oh, happy birthday.
Happy birthday.
And so he's my oldest. And then our middle son is Zachary, and he's 5. And then our youngest son, who's 2.5, is Conley. And it's Conley. Conley.
3 boys. Well,
yeah, 3 boys. Yeah. They keep us busy.
I bet. Oh my goodness. Yeah. I just find it interesting. And I think the more we talk about it as a community, I think that's how, we can help each other heal and have a different path, because, there's no reason there is, I don't believe. And I think maybe for some people there is stuff that they need to let go of right at diagnosis. But for me, I feel like it's jumping the gun and it's putting us in the wrong boat and on the wrong path if from diagnosis or birth we look at our child, or we're told, and most of the time it's because someone tells us to do it, to grieve what they won't be. Like, I mean, you wouldn't do that for anybody else. Like nobody, like there's no other, I don't think there's any other child. Like if a child is born, like the doctor's not going to, hand this beautiful gift over to you, which took a lot to make and to be born, and say, grieve. Like there are times to grieve, and parents have that experience. But when your child is born, and it's such a gift to you, I think that puts this cloud, and I think it puts us in that place of feeling like our child is less,
Yeah, and I think that even, it kind of even started right at the initial ultrasound. When we were going through the ultrasound, and the technician who was doing it was asking lots of questions, and asking about us and everything, and about halfway through, all of a sudden she started getting quiet, and we could kind of tell there's something going on here, and she was kind of going back to certain areas and looking over and over, and we were kind of starting to wonder, okay, is there something going on here? And then she left and came back with the doctor, and even the doctor who came in kind of had a bit of a somber tone to tell us, there's some markers here that we think may be, indicative of trisomy 21. And some of those markers, are also markers that could potentially be found, I think, in trisomy 13 or trisomy 18, but they thought that, it was potentially trisomy 21. And so then we went to talk with a genetic counselor and go through all that. And so even initially like that, there just seemed to be this like somber tone of just, oh, I'm sorry, and I even had a few people when we told them that we initially had the diagnosis of our child having trisomy 21 that we were going to be having, and a few of them even said, oh, I'm sorry. And it was just like, I get and I understand where that comes from, because our kids face a lot of medical issues, and so there are certain things that come along with a diagnosis of trisomy 21, where you face these additional challenges and they face these additional challenges. But just I think to have that almost downtrodden type of experience, I think it's so unfortunate because there just are so many wonderful kiddos with Down syndrome out there, and adults that are just they bring so much joy to this world. And I do wish that more people would have experiences with individuals with Down syndrome in their life, and be able to just have that richness and fullness of understanding what it's like to be someone with Down syndrome, and to have a loved one with Down syndrome. And I do get from from the medical perspective of it, of the fact that there are these medical challenges, and I think that for the doctor who came in and kind of gave us the diagnosis, at the time, 7 years ago, one of the things that came up is whether or not we would continue with the pregnancy. And then when we went back, several weeks later for the next follow-up ultrasound, when we came in, she came back in, and she said, "Oh, so I guess you decided to continue with the pregnancy," almost surprised. And for us, that was like, well, why wouldn't we? Why wouldn't we continue? We're gonna love this child no matter what. But I realized too that from her perspective, when I've been looking through research and researching Down syndrome, unfortunately, and there was a study done in the late 90s and the early 2000s that in America, close to 2/3 of pregnancies with a diagnosis of trisomy 21 were terminated and aborted. And so I'm sure for her experiences, having the majority of those diagnoses end in a termination in the pregnancy, I get, where that for her is probably a bit, more surprising for somebody that decides to continue. And I think that it's just so unfortunate that trend has been there. And, I think that hopefully that's going to change as we see more inclusion, as we see more people with Down syndrome being involved with so many aspects of society, being actors and being in movies and in TV shows and being on different ads and commercials and things like that. And but yeah, I mean, I think it just for us, it was just kind of a little unfortunate that some of what we went through wasn't even necessarily from us, but it was external forces of people, kind of how they kind of addressed and handled the situation that we were going through.
I feel like I'd say most of it
we've
is
always found that.
societal and from the outside. And a lot of what you were saying is about the reaction from the nurse and the doctor and people who call you and say, "I'm so sorry." I think this is what I've learned, or what I feel after 13 years, is that it's a huge misunderstanding. They have no idea, and they don't even know what they're propagating. Like, they do not realize that the stereotypes and the beliefs and feelings that they are propagating come from such an archaic understanding, and actually the attempted obliteration of individuals with disabilities from society. Like it's like they don't, like that's the message that they're passing on. And when a doctor says, "Oh, well, there's all these medical issues," the medical profession had a very aggressive hand in the misperceptions of Down syndrome, because the medical profession refused to treat our children because they didn't see their lives as equal or to have a value. And I feel like it's changing. Like, our pediatrician when Liam was born she's been amazing the entire time. Like, for the last 13 years, she luckily was one of those doctors who understood, who have had experience with individuals with Down syndrome, and had a real open conversations about any of the medical challenges our children are prone to sometimes. But also that they're not exclusive to our children, which is, I think, that's what the medical profession would have us feel. Many children without Down syndrome have these same experiences. When they get those diagnoses, the doctors provide lots of medical help and understanding as to how those children will overcome and live healthy, happy lives. But they don't historically do that for our children. They actively denied our children heart surgeries.
Yeah, what
And-
doesn't get much press is the
Right.
fact, like you think of in our household, we have a son with Down syndrome that has no heart conditions. We have a typical daughter who wears glasses, and Liam does not wear glasses. So
And I believe the medical profession is responsible for that high 2/3 percentage, because they're the ones that come to you when you come for your next appointment and go, oh, you decided it's
yeah, that shouldn't be said. I mean, that's
I'm so hopeful
very insensitive.
for the fact that our world is turning inclusive and diverse, that there are people going to medical school who have been in inclusive classrooms, who understand our child isn't there as a token. Our child is actually there because they're equal and they have the equal ability. Like so many children learn at different paces. At different rates, and they're given the, what is it? Like the forest, not the tree. Look at the forest, look at the long game. They're going to get it.
Yeah.
Like we get that conversation all the time with our daughter. She's going to get it. Just give her, be patient. She's going to get it. And when she gets it, she'll get it all the time. With our son,
It's like start shaking their
if
head
he didn't
right away.
get it, like at like the earliest milestone, it was like, well, let's take him off curriculum. It's like there's no, there's not a balance there. It's a game that's really geared toward the outcome that they desire. But I do believe that that's changing
Through inclusion and also through the medical profession being exposed to children with Down syndrome from as a younger, as classmates, whatever, or having a sibling with Down syndrome or having a child with Down syndrome. I mean, that's what really made me want to have, or made us want to have you on the program so quickly, because as soon as I heard about you, there must be others out there. But of all the researchers we've met,
They usually go into it once they have an
especially
individual
with
in their life.
Alzheimer's research, it's a part of Alzheimer's research that is available, and I know the outcome of researching Alzheimer's in children with Down syndrome is looking at the forest, not the trees. Can we help all of society with Alzheimer's? And this might be a secret key, which could really benefit
We'll
our
take
children.
it.
That's great.
We'll take
but
it.
Just the personal connection you have with the research, that you have a son with Down syndrome, uniquely that you are already studying Alzheimer's, but to then have that personal connection. And so it's not just a clinical specimen research, it's a personal research.
Has your research changed much?
Yeah, so I will say when my son was born, I was a graduate student here at Washington University in St. Louis, and so that's where I'm currently now doing a postdoctoral. I'm a postdoctoral research scholar now at WashU, and so when I was doing my graduate work, I was really fortunate to be in a lab that was really on the cutting edge of Alzheimer's research. I was in the lab of Dr. David Holtzman, who at the time, he was the chairman of the Department of Neurology. He's actually just recently now become the director for the Knight Alzheimer's Disease Research Center here at WashU. And so in that lab, it's a fairly big lab, and there was a lot of different research interests of the lab focused on various aspects of Alzheimer's disease, but a lot of the focus of the research was kind of looking more broadly at the general population, looking at what they refer to as a late onset Alzheimer's disease, which occurs, tends to occur in people over the age of 65, but also, looking at those with familial Alzheimer's disease, where there's certain genetic mutations that can be passed down through families. And so those individuals tend to get an earlier onset of the disease, sometimes even in their 30s and 40s. And so, the focus of the lab was, kind of primarily we would use animal models, we would use mice as a model system to try to look at different aspects of Alzheimer's pathology, looking at things like the amyloid beta plaques which are these plaques that accumulate of these proteins that start to clump up inside of the brain outside of cells, but then also looking at the neurofibrillary tangles, which are these aggregations and these clumps of this protein called tau, and these proteins accumulate inside of the neurons, and they are the tau protein that aggregates tends to be what causes the neurons to start to struggle and start to die off. And that's when you get a lot of that pathology, you start to get the atrophy of the brain tissue. And we can even see that in the mouse models, and then trying to take that and to translate that into potential therapeutics. But at the time, the focus of the lab, there wasn't much of a focus on Down syndrome in particular. But I will say I was really fortunate in that Dr. Holtzman actually, he did his training in the lab of Dr. Bill Mobley. And Dr. Bill Mobley is actually one of the leaders in researching Alzheimer's disease and Down syndrome. And so Dr. Holtzman had a background in his training, and he was actually a Down syndrome scholar back when he was doing his training and his research. So he had that background and knows very well about how Alzheimer's affects those with Down syndrome. And so when my son was born and I was in his lab, he had a very good understanding of what we were going to be going through and facing. And as I started to transition towards the later stages of graduate school, I started thinking about, okay, all of this knowledge that I've been accruing and accumulating through my work, how can I take all of this and start to think about ways to then, focus that in on Down syndrome, and what can we do to take all this knowledge that we're learning about the general population and those who either get a familial Alzheimer's disease or the more sporadic late onset form. How can we take all that and then start thinking about that in the context of trisomy 21 for individuals that have this extra copy of the 21st chromosome? And so now, I was very fortunate that I was able to get a position in the lab of Dr. Andrew Yu here at WashU, who is actually developing these really unique model systems using samples, skin samples from individuals, where you can take these fibroblasts, which come from these skin samples, and directly turn them into neurons of the brain. Wow. And so you can actually take these skin samples from people with different types of diseases, different types of neurodegenerative diseases, and turn them into neurons and actually study them in a dish and look at how these neurons are potentially impacted by some of this different disease pathology. And so his lab in the past has looked at different diseases like Huntington's disease, and we're actually now in the lab starting to look at taking skin samples from individuals that have Alzheimer's disease that are older. And so one of the projects that I have started to now take on is looking at samples that have been obtained from individuals with Down syndrome, to then try to convert these cells into neurons and to be able to study in a dish how some of this Alzheimer's disease pathology accumulates. And so that's where I've kind of transitioned, now from doing the more broad type of research into Alzheimer's disease and to now kind of turn that into a focus on Down syndrome and actually using these samples that actually have trisomy 21, these skin samples, and converting them into brain cells.
We were lucky enough to meet Dr. Bill Mobley at the T21 conference in Long Beach last year. Very fascinating individual to talk to. Before we get further in the research, just to clarify for myself, maybe others had this question, is I see in research many times there's this late onset and early onset Alzheimer's research. I think of 23andMe and different places where you do the ApoE4 gene variant to check if you have it, if you have copies of that. And a lot of that research is late onset Alzheimer's disease. You were talking about early, and I always think of people with Down syndrome having early onset.
Yeah.
And is there a big difference between those two researches, and especially in your research with Down syndrome?
So yes, that's it's interesting. So as you said, you kind of hear a lot about the more late onset form, and that's because actually the majority of cases are the late onset form, more than 95% of cases. And so in those individuals, it's more sporadic. And as you mentioned, the ApoE gene, that was actually what I focused in on for my graduate work, was the ApoE gene. And, that's been identified as the strongest genetic risk factor for more sporadic late onset form. But there's also been these studies over the last few years where they've been able to identify some other genetic risk factors that can influence an individual's risk for the late onset form. But when it comes to then the early onset form, these familial cases, there's really three main genes that have been identified with mutations that cause the early onset form. One is the APP gene, which is the amyloid precursor protein gene, and that's actually found on the 21st chromosome.
Mm-hmm.
And so and that is actually the gene that then makes the protein that makes amyloid beta and causes the plaques. But then the other two are genes called presenilin 1 and presenilin 2. And these genes are actually part of a complex that cuts the APP gene into the amyloid beta peptide. And so these three genes are all involved with the process of producing this amyloid beta that then makes plaques in the brain. And so it causes them to either make more of this amyloid beta or to make a more toxic form of the amyloid beta. And that's what really causes them to get this earlier onset. And so when you then think about individuals with Down syndrome who have trisomy 21, who have this extra copy of the APP gene, they're making 50% more of the product of that gene. And so they're actually generating more of this amyloid beta, which then causes them to get this accumulation of this amyloid beta in their brains and to make these plaques. And so all individuals with Down syndrome, by the time they reach their 40s, anyone that's ever been looked at, they all have this plaque pathology in their brain by the time they reach the 40s. And so that causes then, them to be at a much greater risk for developing a more earlier onset. And so when then comparing, some of these, these different groups of individuals, there are some unique things in terms of how those that get the earlier onset, so those that have a familial mutation compared to those that are more sporadic. But then there's, also with those with Down syndrome, there's also some unique things with them, but also some overlaps with, the more general population and things like that. And so when trying to think about, how we can go about treating, each of these different populations and groups, there's been a lot of work looking at different biomarkers and trying to be able to look at different stages of how the disease develops over time in all of these different populations. And there's been a tremendous amount of work looking at those that have both the late onset form of the disease, but also even the early onset familial form as well. And so now we're really fortunate that over the last few years now, there's actually been this consortium called the Alzheimer's Biomarker Consortium for Down Syndrome, or the ABCDS. And so that started back in 2020, and it's this consortium across the country at 8 different sites, including here at WashU, and then also in the UK with the University of Cambridge. And it's a study where they're enrolling, I believe it's 550 participants with Down syndrome, to start looking at these different biomarkers and how they develop over time. And it involves doing imaging of the brain, using these different imaging agents, where we can actually administer these agents and put someone in a PET scanner. And we can actually, these agents go in and they bind specifically either to the amyloid beta plaques, or there's other agents that can bind to the tau tangles. And we can actually see not only how much of the plaques or tangles are present, but where they're present. And we can start to get an understanding, while someone's still alive, of whether or not they are developing these accumulations of these proteins that may give us an idea of where they are in the course of the disease. And so now this is being done for those with Down syndrome through this consortium. And we're using CSF samples and blood samples, doing cognitive assessments, so that we can get a better understanding of the trajectory of how this disease develops in those with Down syndrome over time, with the hopes that if we can identify where someone is in the course of the disease, that we can start to use different types of therapeutics that can intervene at, and hit specific targets based on that individual's course of where they are. And so it's a wonderful time right now for this research, and not only for Alzheimer's research more broadly, but in particular for those with Down syndrome. And I think a lot of what we're learning about the general population and how Alzheimer's develops, we're being able to then kind of translate that over into Down syndrome. But I think, as I think you were kind of alluding to, I think really there is going to be so much that we are going to understand from those with Down syndrome that we can then apply to the general population. And I really do think that those with Down syndrome really hold the key, and I think they're going to provide us with some wonderful, unique information that's going to provide insights into how we treat Alzheimer's disease more broadly. And so yeah, it's really just kind of an exciting time to be in this phase of where we are and understanding the disease and in so many different levels.
Science is amazing. It's when you were talking about taking the skin samples and then turning them into neurons.
The neurons,
Yeah.
the neurons in the brain, those are the main cells that kind of do all the firing in the brain, yeah.
But these plaques that develop on the brain, it's not just specific to individuals with Down syndrome. It's just that people with Down syndrome have that extra chromosome. And the reason why it's higher is because that means they have an extra copy of that, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah.
Because that's something that we learned from Dr. Scottco last year, that it's that it's because of the fact that there's just an extra copy.
It lays right on that 21st. Yeah.
And there was something else that we spoke about, and I don't know if this is part of your research or something that just as being a researcher that's also a parent of an individual with Down syndrome, but Dr. Scottco was talking about different things as far as diet or different things that we intake that add to the building of that plaque that we can eliminate or moderate in the diet. Can you speak on that?
Yeah, no, and actually, I listened to that podcast with Dr. Scottco, and I was remember the acronym he used was SMART, which stood for different things that you can do to look at different lifestyle factors, and that's actually something that's been really kind of an interest for me, and trying to think about different ways that in particular for those with Down syndrome, what are ways that you can start to introduce, just even little minor things that could improve, different lifestyle choices on a daily basis. And for me, I actually, while I was doing my graduate work for my PhD, I had an opportunity to do some science outreach. And at the St. Louis Science Center here, we through the neuroscience program, we do something called the Amazing Brain Carnival, which is something where we go and we do demonstrations and we set up different tables at the science center, and kids of all ages that come to the science center, we get an opportunity to teach them a little bit about the brain, and through this program they actually encourage students to come up with their own demonstration. And so I started to think about, like, okay, what's something that I can do to try to teach someone as young as 5 or 6 all the way up to teenagers and even adults, to just introduce a little bit of some of these concepts of Alzheimer's and things that we can do to on our daily basis, just little lifestyle choices. And so I came up with this thing called the Amazing Brain Game, or that the whole idea was to try to get kids thinking about if I am going to eat a meal, if I choose a salad, I can keep the plaques out of my brain and protect my brain versus, eating something like a double cheeseburger, which, can potentially cause, these things to build up. And so that has been something, that I've been very interested in throughout the years. And especially for those with Down syndrome, just given, some of the differences in metabolism, some of the issues around hypotonia, and things like that. I think it's just so important from an early age, especially, with kids that are developing, to start trying to just do those, little things that you can introduce early on that hopefully will really set the stage, throughout their life to live an active lifestyle, to eat, in a more healthy manner, and really to just get their brains engaged, and that's one of the things that's been really interesting and studying the brain, is that and with the ability to just keep the brain active, it helps in building this, what's kind of referred to as a cognitive reserve. And so there's been really interesting studies showing that people that tend to be, more engaged socially, that tend to engage their brains by learning new things, if they're more active in going to museums and outings and things like that, that really it stimulates the brain and it causes the neurons to make more connections, and it really builds this reserve of having this more diversified neuronal network. And so as you then begin to age, if you've really done a good job throughout your life of really staying engaged and keeping your brain active, if you do start to face some of these pathologies, if you do start to get some amyloid beta that's accumulating and clumping up and starting to cause a little bit of some of these issues, you've kind of really built this nice, healthy, robust network that can start to deal with that and help clear some of these proteins out and deal with some of those issues. So that is definitely something that I know they're also through the Alzheimer's Biomarker Consortium for Down syndrome looking at some of these different lifestyle factors, but also comorbidities if individuals have potentially diabetes or any other issues, cardiovascular issues, things like that, to try to look at some of these different influences that are impacting the disease as well. It's something for me that personally in my own research, it's not something that I research personally, but it's definitely something for me that I'm very, very interested in and always want to raise more awareness about and learn more about as well.
Is there a place in the research that discusses, because, we are still, even though IDEA was put into place many, many years ago, we finally found a school that actually educates our son. But for from preschool to fifth grade, we had to fight enthusiastically for an education because the school system believed that our child just needed to be there to be socialized and didn't provide an education, didn't provide that cognitive stimulation. It was easier to just, say, we'll just put them in the classroom with, not receiving the education, basically, not working to develop the brain, not giving the accommodations to access the curriculum. Is there any place in the research that demonstrates the difference between an individual who is not receiving that cognitive input, i.e. an education, versus the individual who has actually received an education, we have a lot of individuals now who are actually attending college, but not just in a lifestyles. What is that called? What is that kind of class where it teaches living, independent living?
Yeah.
That used to be what our children were offered if it was going to be post high school education. Now individuals with Down syndrome are going to college and getting degrees, and I'm curious as to how that affects that individual's risk versus the individual who has been denied cognitive input.
Yeah, no, I know more broadly, there's been a lot of work, looking at education and connections with Alzheimer's disease. And so there's, been several studies that have shown that there's, this direct correlation between the amount of education, those that, get high school degrees, college degrees, postgraduate degrees, and their rate of developing Alzheimer's disease. And so for those that do, get more years of education that go on to college and to get postgraduate degrees, they have a lower rate of Alzheimer's disease. And there can be different factors that may play into that, as far as socioeconomic status and different, lifestyle factors that can play into one's upbringing as far as, access to healthy food and how that then, correlates into the ability to go on and get an education. But there's been, I think very clearly this demonstration that, the more education you're able to receive, the more that you are able to not only engage your brain, but to really to drive your brain to learn new things and to really make those new connections and to really, build that throughout your life, through your education, that decreases your risk, for developing Alzheimer's disease. And, I think that for those with Down syndrome, I'm almost certain that that's also going to be, a similar correlation. And I think that, we're kind of in this new era for those with Down syndrome because, as you mentioned, there are these new programs for those with Down syndrome as they graduate from high school and they go on to college or to do these training programs that give them opportunities to get jobs that are meaningful, that they really can, that they can have to give them a purpose in life and to go on through their adulthood, to contribute to society and also to make a living for themselves. And so I think that, there's still a lot of work and research to be done in the Down syndrome community to really look at that more in depth. But for the general population, that's been work that's been done and really shown that there is definitely this correlation. And so I think that in and of itself just really lends more credence to the fact that we really need to make sure that we are doing everything to have more inclusive environments for our kids. And I will say we've been incredibly fortunate that for our son that, for the most part, through the schooling system, when we've gone into IEPs, we've really had wonderful teachers and advocates that have really tried to push for as much inclusion as possible. And right now, our son, about 70% of his minutes are in the gen ed setting where he's amongst his peers, learning right side by side with them. And then, he has that time with the one-on-one time to really kind of focus in on certain learning goals and things like that. But I think that, that should be the norm. Like every child with Down syndrome should be, trying to be pushed to reach their full potential and not just simply like, oh, well, they can't do that. Well, we'll just kind of have them over there and, they can kind of just, sit on the sidelines, if you will, or whatever, but to really just like you would for any other child to push them, especially now that we're learning so much about throughout the course of one's life, how this then sets them up to impact as they transition into adulthood. And then, as they begin to age in adulthood and how that's influencing that cognitive reserve, that overall cognitive function as they begin to age, to just try to from an early age, set them up for success throughout their life, to really just to be able to fight off Alzheimer's disease and to not have to deal with, that dementia that can develop.
I feel like the entire journey is about equanimity from the diagnosis into like when we're talking about higher education and we're having the conversation of like, oh, now our kids are able to go and take these classes where maybe they can live and have a meaningful life. It's like that isn't any conversation that we're allowed to have about anyone else. Like we're not allowed to have that conversation because if it's about anyone else, there's a big light shined on how inappropriate and wrong it is. And I feel like it's just, from the diagnosis, there's the value of the life isn't there because of these misperceptions that have nothing to do with the chromosome. Everything that individuals with Down syndrome have experienced, and it comes from the Industrial Revolution and trying to obliterate the individuals with cognitive disabilities out of our society because of what they were trying to create, which we can't even go into that conversation. And then the institutions they created by institutionalizing our children and pulling them from society, taking them from their parents, in this quest to uphold the family unit, which is just so disgusting. If that's the coattail you're still riding on, you need to ask yourself why, as a society, that's still something that you're upholding. And I think that most of society looks at an individual who lived in an institution, who was given no input, and they've taken that and said, this is Down syndrome. And doing that, they've created it, and then they've created all of these other challenges in the life of an individual with Down syndrome that aren't necessarily what if you took an individual with Down syndrome and gave him the same equality, that life, the same equality, the same opportunities, the same education. And that means parents, when they're trying to tell you your child isn't going to read, that's garbage. They might read a little bit later, but they should have the same equality of we're just going to wait till it clicks, whatever level it clicks on, whatever, wherever it is. Let that child tell you. Don't let some outsider who most of the time has no real understanding, right? The rest of the time, I feel, has an obscured understanding. And then there's the individuals who have an understanding, who have know the experience, that those should be the ones. Like, I'm happy that you have advocates in your IEP. It's what I've wished for and believed for. I think that's evolution. That's how we evolve. We see what we did wrong, and then we change it. And I feel like a lot of these challenges come from the fact that our children have historically not been looked at
Equally.
Yeah, and I know I will say, I'm very fortunate that one of the best advocates is actually my wife. She's had the experience. She's been in the system. She was a special education teacher for 13 years. And she's doing her own work now as a tutor, actually, for children with dyslexia. She's actually trained in that, and as you mentioned, children with dyslexia used to be think like, oh, they don't know how to learn. They're kind of, just, they don't get it. But then we started realizing, oh, wait, there's actually a processing in the brain that is slightly different here, and they just learn in a different way. And so now you're seeing, that on a regular basis, kids are being screened for dyslexia because there's so much more of an awareness for it. And so, for us, when it comes to the IEPs, my wife, it's so funny because there'll be times when we go into an IEP and she'll be like, okay, these are the things we need to focus on. And if they say this, we need to be able to make sure we're prepared to, and sure enough, there'll be certain keywords and things that she'll pick up on and be like, oh, let me come back with this to really kind of just say, hey, according to the Free and Fair Appropriate Education Act, this is something that needs to be addressed. And it's not just, factoring in this, but all, and so she's been, absolutely wonderful when it comes to, making sure that we're getting, the most that we can from our IEP meetings. But we have, like I said, we've been really fortunate to be, in a wonderful education system that has, had teachers that really want to see the best for our son. And when you mention in terms of just kind of some of the outdated approaches, when you think back that back into the 40s and 50s, from the medical perspective of how we addressed those with Down syndrome, and as you're mentioning, the institutionalization, the median life expectancy for those with Down syndrome back in the 40s and 50s was 1 year old. And that came from the fact that half of children born with Down syndrome have major congenital heart defects that if they're not addressed, usually within the first year of life, they'll pass away. And so the average life expectancy and the median life expectancy over the last, 60, 70 years has just tremendously skyrocketed. Back in the 70s, the average life expectancy was in the 20s, and now we're getting to where the average life expectancy is reaching, in the 60s. And there's, it's hard to find many populations where you've seen that much of an increase. And so with that, over these last few decades, that's been an amazing and wonderful thing to see, the average life expectancy increase like that. But because of that, we're now starting to realize there are the issues around aging that, our loved ones with Down syndrome are facing. And that's where, when it comes to thinking about, from the different medical perspectives of treating all the different things that they may face early on in life, it's also important that as we start to realize that we have this increasing aging population of those with Down syndrome, that we also need to focus in on how to age in a healthy manner and to address things like Alzheimer's disease. And so even when it comes to something like Alzheimer's disease, we're actually incredibly fortunate that just a week ago, the FDA for the first time approved one of the first treatments for Alzheimer's disease that has been shown to directly target and modify the underlying pathology. So this drug called lecanemab, that is going to, it's marketing as Leqembi, it was shown to actually slow the rate of decline. And this is the first time ever, the first time for Alzheimer's treatments that we've actually now have a treatment that can be administered. And it's unique. It's more to the individuals that are in the earlier stages of the disease to try to delay the progression. But those trials, there was another drug, aducanumab, that it received an accelerated approval with some controversy. And there was another drug, donanemab, that has recently shown promising results as well. But all of those clinical trials, they excluded individuals with Down syndrome. And that to me is just so disheartening. And, for a population that we know is so highly susceptible to this disease, it's just so unfortunate. And there are the reasons as far as having that extra copy of the 21st chromosome. There are some certain, complications that can arise from these treatments, but to not, side by side be also looking at how we can include those with Down syndrome through these trials. Now, I will say that now that we're seeing some of these results from these trials, there are now efforts to, there is an actual, through the NIH, an Alzheimer's trial unit for those with Down syndrome, where they're starting to now begin trials and to try some of these different therapeutics that are showing promise in those with Down syndrome. But this drug just got approved, and right now it can't be given to those with Down syndrome because they were excluded and not included in these trials. And to me, I think that this is just a lesson in, not only having inclusion throughout different aspects of society when it comes to education, but from the medical research side of things. I feel there's no reason why, we aren't doing more to make sure and make the concerted effort to make sure that this population is included, because we know how much this disease impacts them. And so there are wonderful efforts being undertaken, but I think that there's still work to be done in that area.
Why do you think we're so polite? Like, I mean, because I think that if I'm going to say it again, if it was any other marginalized group, there would be signs and loud voices and people in Congress and, this study can't be done because it's discriminatory and non-inclusive. I mean, you can why are we so polite? I feel like I mean, part of I really try to stay peaceful, and I feel like part of the biggest challenge that I had in fighting for my son's education is I tried so damn hard to be so polite all of the time. I brought muffins and gave gift cards and did all of these things to try to be polite, to try to, make it okay and make it nice. And in fact, I think we need to call it what it is, and it's discrimination. It's wrong, and it needs to be called at every avenue that we see it. And if it makes people uncomfortable, they can be uncomfortable. Because I'm uncomfortable that my son's not included. I'm uncomfortable that I had to hire a lawyer every year to get an education. It makes me uncomfortable that I have to watch my daughter, and how it affects her that her brother isn't seen as equal. I wish that we weren't so polite sometimes. I really wish that we were, weren't afraid to hurt people's feelings, because those are not the feelings. The feelings that are discriminatory and segregate and are non-inclusive, and those feelings, they don't care. And I just, we have to be their voice, right? We have to be their voice, and their voice has to be loud. And, you look at when you say in the 1950s and that statistic that children didn't live to be past 1 year old, doctors would say, well, I'm going to take you don't want to go through this pain because your child's going to die. Never told the mom the child's going to die because I am going to actually violate my oath. They take an oath. Doctors take an oath that they will save a life if they can. So do we go back and talk to each of those doctors that denied surgeries and tell them that they broke their oath and that they should have their license to practice medicine revoked? Is that what we should do? Because I think that sounds about right. You've let somebody die. You've let a child die. How do you sleep? But instead, we just do our best. And I think they know that. I think that they know that we have other things on our plate. I'm sorry. That just made
Tom,
it just really impassions me, Tom, because I'm going to tell you this, when your research makes discoveries about Down syndrome, I'm going to guarantee you that you're not going to be able to say this is only for people with Down syndrome. Because,
no one.
They're going to be like, oh, thank you, Tom.
Yeah,
and they're going to take it.
Yeah, no, and I approach my research with that in the back of my head of not only how can this help the Down syndrome community, but how can this help everyone? And because I initially started kind of focusing more broadly, and I will say that, I before I started graduate school here at WashU, I worked as a research assistant in the Holtzman lab for 3 years. And then, between being in graduate school and almost like I've been here at WashU, which, WashU is a wonderful research institution. It's a wonderful university that has really been on the forefront and the cutting edge of Alzheimer's research. But I will say, before my son was born, when I was here for about 5 years, I could probably count on my hand the number of presentations and talks that I saw come through into my email inbox, that were going to be taking place. I could probably count on my hand the number that even focused on Down syndrome at all, let alone with a focus on Alzheimer's disease. And, once we got the diagnosis of the fact that we were going to have a child with Down syndrome, I started thinking about, okay, well, what's being done here? What's being done, to focus in on how Alzheimer's is impacting those with Down syndrome. And I recognize that there is such an opportunity here that there's no reason why this type of research couldn't be being pushed, not only here at WashU, but, to continue to push it more across, the country and across the world, and when I would start going to talks, and people would be talking about different aspects of Alzheimer's, I would start raising my hand and I would say, well, what about those with Down syndrome? How might this impact them? And I could tell that there would be times where I'd ask these questions and I could see people kind of, start looking around and kind of going, oh yeah, I hadn't thought about that. And, I think that from the research side of things that, especially when it comes to a disease like Alzheimer's disease, I think that almost everyone that gets involved in this work has some type of personal motivation for it. They have, a loved one who maybe went through this disease, and they come from a place of really wanting to make a difference in doing this work. But I think that sometimes it's just unfortunate that those with Down syndrome are kind of not always at the forefront. And so that's one thing that I've been really trying to continue to do is whenever I kind of see some opportunity where somebody may be, giving a talk about Alzheimer's disease, if there's something that I think may be influential in Down syndrome, or there may be some connection there, I try to either raise my hand and ask that question, or I go up and I talk to them afterwards just to continue to raise that awareness and to just try to get people thinking about, our loved ones with Down syndrome and how we can really take all this wonderful, amazing knowledge that we're learning about the brain and about Alzheimer's and how we can then apply that and get more people thinking about inclusion and really getting, because if we're going to get to a world without Alzheimer's disease, the only way we get there is if it includes everybody.
Yeah.
We can't sit there and all of a sudden have these treatments and go, hey, we're achieving a world without Alzheimer's disease, and then have this little asterisk that says, oh, sorry, except for those with Down syndrome, we're not there yet. We have to make sure that they come along on this journey and that, that they're right there, with the rest of us as we start to face, this disease, and we start to try to, really address and have these different therapeutics that can really make a difference and for all of us, really.
Well, we need you there, so keep pushing. We need you in the conferences and amongst your colleagues, raising your hand and talking to them. Are these treatments specific to? Are they geared toward the APP? If so, that seems like people with Down syndrome are perfect candidates.
Yeah, no, and that's actually so the three that I mentioned that have been kind of on the leading edge, aducanumab, lecanemab, and donanemab. That mab at the end, MAB, stands for monoclonal antibody. And what they are they're these antibodies that are specifically targeted at the amyloid beta. And so these antibodies go in and they bind to and they clear out these plaques and they help prevent more plaques from developing. And this is exactly what happens in our loved ones with Down syndrome. And a lot of the therapeutics have been focused on this amyloid beta because, there's been this prevailing theory called the amyloid cascade, which throughout the decades, we've kind of been able to identify that this amyloid beta that accumulates is really kind of this initiating cascade where you get these plaques that then causes a lot of distress of the cells. Then you start to get the tau tangles that form, and then you start to get the cell death. So, one of the great things that we've been able to learn through all this biomarker work is that we can start to identify people that are getting these plaques before they're even showing cognitive symptoms and starting to show any signs of dementia. And so by being able to identify these people, these types of treatments can be applied to help target that amyloid beta early on to then prevent and delay the disease. And that's something that for those with Down syndrome is exactly what they face. Like I said, there's all individuals by the time they reach their 40s, as they get into adulthood, they start to get this accumulation of this amyloid beta and this formation of plaques. And so these types of treatments, I think, really hold a lot of promise. And the fact that we are seeing the outcomes from these clinical trials showing promise, it's a really exciting time. And I've heard so many Alzheimer's researchers say who have been doing this for decades, hoping and just praying that we could, get some of these treatments to really show some positive outcomes. And there's been so many failed trials. And so to be at this point where we just, within, a week ago, just got this this full approval of this FDA approved therapeutic, to know that it is a treatment that has so much tremendous implication for those with Down syndrome is very exciting. But now it's just a matter of just really getting it done and making sure that this is, that these trials are being done for those with Down syndrome.
Now, your previous research in ApoE, maybe ApoE4 variant, did you kind of refocus your specialty because of your son? I mean, I don't know, and you would know this, but just for the layperson, when you do a gene test to see if you have ApoE4 variant, if you have that copy, you have like a 3 times amount more chance of getting Alzheimer's or late onset Alzheimer's. If you have a double copy of that, it could be 10 times.
Yeah.
Are those genes, and I know that's genetic, so that might be why, but genetically passed down, are those ApoE4, like specifically 4 variant, is that seen in people with Down syndrome?
Yeah, so that's a great question. It's actually a question that I had early on. And when I started to kind of look at, okay, what is the focus of my research for graduate school been, and how might it apply, for those with Down syndrome? When I was looking through the literature, it was actually rather interesting because there were some reviews and some studies that did like a meta-analysis trying to pull data from multiple studies to look at that risk in Down syndrome. And as you mentioned, for those that have 1 copy, it's 3-fold increase. For those that have 2 copies, it's a 10 to 12-fold increase. But for Down syndrome, it's rather interesting because the increased risk if you have ApoE4 is actually a little bit more minimal. It's only about, the odds ratios are like maybe a 1.8 to like a 2.2. So roughly about a 2-fold increase if you have 1 or 2 copies. So it's not having as strong of an effect, but that in and of itself is rather interesting. Why is that? And I think it's interesting also that those with familial Alzheimer's disease that get an early onset, they also have a less of an influence of this ApoE genetic risk factor. And so I think that, that can kind of start to give us insight into, okay, well, if you're getting an early onset form and you're really getting this accelerated plaque formation, what is the role of ApoE in that context versus the role of ApoE in a more late onset sporadic form, to help inform us of what this gene is doing in both instances to give us a better understanding of it. And we're starting to understand more about how ApoE from the inflammatory standpoint, there's immune cells in the brain that, as this pathology develops, we see these immune cells called microglia, all of a sudden they turn on the production of ApoE. And we're starting to learn more about what that gene is doing in the case of this neuroinflammation that's occurring during the disease process. And so we are, we're learning more about how this gene is influencing these different populations. And in particular, for those with Down syndrome, with these different studies that are being done, we are looking to see, how many of these individuals are ApoE4 carriers. How is that influencing not only the time at which they may develop the disease? Does it cause them potentially to get it at a younger age? But also, how does that affect the rate of the decline? Is this causing them to have a more accelerated progression? of the disease. And it appears that, it may not have as much of an influence in Down syndrome, but I think that that in and of itself is really interesting and telling about what the role of this gene is. And again, that's a good example of how better understanding what's happening in Down syndrome may, provide us an opportunity to then apply that and learn more about what the role is in the general population.
Yeah, that shouldn't be understated that people with Down syndrome shouldn't be excluded out of ApoE research either, just because they're not affected as much. Like, we need to have that together. We should include it in all, there's no reason not to include.
But honestly, like, as a parent of an individual with Down syndrome, having that information, that's another bit of information that dismantles the medical opinion that an individual with Down syndrome, has more challenges medically, like is more exposed to everything. I feel like in that case, having the extra chromosome is a benefit.
Yeah, probably benefited
right?
from the gene. Yeah,
right.
Or possibly, right.
Well, and there's actually it's interesting, for the fact that all adults, by the time they reach the 40s, all adults with Down syndrome have this pathology. Not all adults, as they get into their 50s, 60s, and 70s, not all of them are getting dementia. And so you have individuals in their 60s that are not showing overt signs of dementia, despite the fact that their brains have had some of this pathology accruing for decades. And so what is it? What is it that's unique about these individuals? And through these, through this larger consortium, this ABCDS, this Alzheimer's Biomarker Consortium for Down syndrome, they are looking at, are there certain different mutations and slight genetic changes and other genes that are providing this neuroprotection, that are allowing for some of these individuals to evade this dementia. And that for me is so exciting. That's where I think there is so much potential to start to understand why it is that some of these adults have this neuroprotection, and we can take that and learn from that and understand from that. And that's where I just think it's an exciting time for that work that's being done in that area.
And I know this isn't your research, but I don't know if you know anything about the statistic that cancers are not prevalent in individuals with Down syndrome. Pediatric leukemia is one thing, but as adults that get older, the risk of cancer is not very prevalent in the Down syndrome community.
Yeah. So soft tissue cancers are very rare. And that's something that I think, again, is just so unique, where you can have this opportunity to understand, what's happening to allow for that cancer to not be present. And whether that's, for those with Down syndrome, there are differences in terms of the immune system. There are certain key genes that are present on the 21st chromosome, these interferon genes, that cause the immune system to kind of be in this kind of like hyper-vigilant state, because there's more activation. And is that potentially something that, the immune system is more heightened, so it can get in there and clear those cancer cells faster, and if they're identified? And I think that there's, so many opportunities like that. You mentioned, leukemia. Why is it that, you have something like a blood cancer like leukemia that they're more at risk for, but not, something like a soft tissue cancer? But then also, I think it's also, really unique when you look at a lot of the individuals with Down syndrome that, they tend to be slightly overweight, they have differences in metabolism. And if you actually look at like their blood lipid profiles, and you look at their risk for developing things like atherosclerosis, they actually very rarely get atherosclerosis. So
what is that?
So atherosclerosis is where you get accumulation of plaques within the arteries, and it leads to things like heart attacks. And so why is it that they, are less at risk for things like that? And so that's where I think, when you look at things like Alzheimer's and all these different conditions, there's just so much there to gain from this research. And that's why I'm really hopeful that, this research, into Alzheimer's and these different conditions and those with Down syndrome will continue to develop. And the NIH actually, a few years ago, started this initiative called the Include initiative. And it's, looking at, it's the investigation of co-occurring conditions across the lifespan and those with Down syndrome. And the whole idea is to start looking at these different co-occurring conditions, and to look at those with Down syndrome to see, why is it that certain things they're more at risk for or less at risk for, to then, apply that more broadly to the general population. And then I think, there's just so much wonderful opportunity to learn and to hopefully in the future just to continue this research to make a difference.
Having you at the foundation of the research gives me hope that there's also an equanimity that's there that can only grow and spread.
Well, and you're not only professionally involved, obviously personally involved in this research as well. What is your non-biased, if you can be, prediction for the future in this research? What do you see a kind of a timeline and where you are right now in the research?
Well, I will say, in the last 5 to 6 years, ever since I've had my son, I've been really hopeful based on the trends that I've been seeing. And I think it kind of goes back to I don't know if you're familiar with Frank Stevens and his testimony before Congress. That is actually what led to the Include initiative. And before that, into the early 2000s, the NIH funding for Down syndrome was around 20 to 30 million dollars of the annual budget. Since then, in the last 3 to 5 years, it's gone up to, I think it's around 120 million. So just within the last 5 years or so, there's been more than a tripling in the NIH budget for funding for Down syndrome research. And that to me is just so incredibly hopeful that, on a national level, we're starting to recognize the importance of this research. And along with that, we've also seen this amazing increase in the funding for Alzheimer's research. So, we're seeing, hand in hand, both the increase in the funding for Alzheimer's research as well as the increase in the funding for Down syndrome research. And I think that, more and more, scientific researchers are recognizing that we need to make the investments now, because like I said, we're getting this increasing in the aging population of those with Down syndrome. We're people with Down syndrome are living more fuller lives, but there's still a lot of things to address. And that's where I think that by investing now, we're not only investing in the short term, we're making a lot of advancement, but we're really investing in the future. And by continuing to fund this research now and to continue to increase that funding, it's going to pay dividends 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now, as we continue to make the advancements. Because, it takes a long time for the basic science research discoveries to then be translated into the clinic and to go through clinical trials. These drugs that have been approved, they've been going through clinical trials for 10, 15, 20 years. And we're now just starting to reap the benefit of those. And so, I'm really hopeful and excited to see this trend that is taking place, on a national level to invest and to put the time and the money and the effort into this research. And I'm really hopeful that, this is going to continue on so many levels to reap rewards into the future.
You didn't get to expound upon the research that your son was able to participate in.
Oh, yes. Yeah. So, and so that's actually a very good example. So at the time when we had our diagnosis, I actually went to a talk that was talking about this, it was partly the IBIS, which stands for the Infant Brain Imaging Study, that was focused on kids with autism, but it was expanding into other areas. And they were actually at that time trying to get approval for a pilot study to do this neuroimaging in infants with Down syndrome. And I went and talked to the researcher, Dr. Kelly Badaran, and she said, we're hopeful. We've got good review scores. We're hopeful that, we can get this approval. And, I had reached out to her, and right around the time that our son was born, a few, weeks after, I'd reached out to them to say, hey, have you gotten any updates? And they got approval to do the initial pilot study about 3 weeks before our son turned 3 months old. And the 3-month-old time point was what they were hoping to shoot for. And so a few weeks later, we had my son in the scanner. He was one of the first participants in this pilot study. We went through, so he was going in and getting MRI images done, and he was in the scanner. He would be in the scanner for about an hour and a half.
Oof.
But in order to get a 3-month-old into an MRI scanner, if you've ever had an MRI or heard one of these things, these machines are super loud. So we actually had to train him by, at night, playing MRI sounds, these out sounds to get him acclimated to it. And then when we went in, we would actually put him to sleep, and we would put earplugs in, and he would go into the scanner, and he, would sleep through this hour and a half. And he did it at 3 months of age, 6 months of age, and 12 months of age. We went in,
Wow.
and from that pilot study, there was a total of 10 infants that they looked at. And then after that initial pilot study, the NIH then funded for over $11 million
Mm.
an additional follow-up study that is now across, I think, 4 different sites. And so I actually just saw that they are still actively recruiting and doing this study. And so for my son to be right on the forefront of that and to be a part of that, and to then see how, 7 years later, now that, this study is still ongoing and it's been expanded, it's, been this multi-million-dollar effort. It was just incredibly wonderful to know that, my son's brain was able to be used in a way that has now providing us information about neurodevelopment and how these different, brain areas are developing, and to now have that study be built up and to be continued in the way that it is. It was really wonderful.
Well, what a family. I mean, you between your research
Oh my
and,
goodness.
and your wife is like a ringer in the IEP,
I
and then your son is like basically raised $11 million for for research. I mean, I know there were other people in the study, but we'll give him
but he's
a
the
lot
one
of
who
credit.
did it. I think that's good.
Yeah, fantastic.
I think your wife is a superhero. I would love to have a conversation
we
with
would.
her
We
because I
would.
would love for her to understand. Like, to me, you were saying calling her a ringer. To me, I feel like it's one of those things where she knows. Like,
Oh, yeah.
she knows.
Yeah.
It's like
She
bringing a
knows the
used car
game.
salesman into a
Yeah.
used car salesman pitch,
Right? Like,
Right.
she knows what you're going to say. She knows the truth behind what the law is. And because it's the most frustrating thing it is with education is it's the right word. It's having the difference between the right word and the almost right word, which is who was, I'm going to have to look up and say, because that's a famous
that
quote.
was? Yeah. Well,
hold on.
to have a
because it's the
colleague-
difference between lightning and a lightning bug.
Oh,
And just, knowing the terminology of certain things, how things are phrased when it comes to trying to, have certain minutes and things like that. And I will say, she's now working as a tutor. She started her own tutoring company, but part of that is actually doing advocacy. And so she's now starting to sit in on IEPs for those that would, like to have an advocate that knows a little bit of the system and can kind of to help advocate for them. And so yes, that is something that, she's now realizing that she has this wonderful knowledge that she can use to help others, to really maximize, the potential of what they can achieve through their IEPs.
Well, we would love to have that conversation with her because it's a very important conversation if she's willing to share that gold that she has.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the difference between the almost right word and the right word is the difference between the lightning bug and the lightning. And that was Mark Twain who said that a very, very,
wonderful.
very long time ago. And so,
isn't that nice
and that-
having this all of human knowledge right at your fingertips?
Hey.
That's pretty cool.
but no, I feel like, we'll bring it back around because I do think it's all interconnected. I do think it's about equality. I think you said it before, when you're talking about research, we can't be separate. We shouldn't be separate in the classroom. We shouldn't be separate in society. It's about inclusion across the board. In society, in the world, it's inclusion and diversity because we learn from each other and we're all connected. No matter how much people want to think that we are separate and we're on these separate paths and we don't affect each other, we affect each other in every single way, and with our breath and our words and our thoughts and our attitudes and the way we treat each other. When we can get to a place that we know that we are connected, when we can get to a place that we're not competing, we're doing it for the good of all mankind, all womankind, all humankind. When we can get to that place, I think that's when we will start to see successes across the board, because it's like you're trying to do something and you have this missing piece, but somebody else, it's like putting together a puzzle. Someone else has that piece And it's so much easier when we play together, isn't it? It's so much easier when we work together to find the answers and to change this world for the better, to evolve. And I'm so thankful that you're there. I'm thankful that you're there bringing equality to this research.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And I will say also, I want to thank you guys for all that you do as well. I mean, with this podcast and for all the advocacy that you do, you are making a huge difference as well, and raising this awareness and just bringing to light, all of these different issues and concerns around Down syndrome. I can't thank you enough for all that you do as well.
Well, you were going to be at the retreat.
Yes.
Next month.
Yeah.
So for anybody who signed up for the DSDN retreat, you can look forward to seeing Tom there.
And as a rockin' dad, I'll be a participant. I'll be engaged and enjoying the retreat as well myself.
Are you going for the baseball game?
Oh yes, yeah. I'm a big Cardinals fan, so yep.
Yeah, box seats, perfect.
That's amazing. Maybe you and Ben can come back with us and discuss the retreat and everything. I'd love to be a fly on the wall in some of the conversations and the things that you learn and share. And my hope is that any father who receives a diagnosis never thinks twice about playing baseball with their son, because that, and any mother who receives a diagnosis never doubts or has to grieve any unknown. There's no reason for it. There's too much to celebrate.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Tom.
All right. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Bye-bye. Please follow us on Twitter at If We Knew Then Pod, and you can drop us a line on our Facebook page at If We Knew Then Pod, or visit our website, ifweknewthen.com, to send us an email with questions and comments. And you can join our mailing list there and get alerts of future podcast episodes. All these links will be added to this episode's show notes. Thank you again, and we look forward to you joining us on the next episode of If We Knew Then.